Alright, last recording. Let's see if we can get through this without my dogs barking. Dingo's laying here next to me. I think he's calm, so we'll see. Alright, so again, we are building on our concept map, our final concept map. We've got cardiorespiratory endurance training, and we have a total of 11 training adaptations coming off the top. There are more than 11. This concept map could really be endless. So I have to draw the line and decide what I feel is most important for this class, which are the primary factors. There are many other things that happen with training, but the others don't contribute as much. Okay, so we're looking at an increase in VO2max due to increased cardiac output, increased AVO2 difference. We've already talked about cardiac output, which increases because of increases in stroke volume, because heart rate max doesn't increase. Right now we're focusing on the AVO2 difference side of the map. We've already talked about oxygen delivery rate, and our focus now is on oxygen uptake rate. Okay. In order to take up oxygen, we need to unload it from hemoglobin, and it needs to diffuse quickly. So oxygen uptake rate increases because of increased unloading and increased diffusion rate. Okay, so here we are, greater uptake due to greater unloading, greater diffusion rate. As I said in the last recording, diffusion coefficient doesn't change, diffusion membrane thickness doesn't change. We do get an increase in diffusion membrane area because of an increase in density and recruitment of capillaries, adding to the diffusion area between the capillary and the muscle cells. On this recording, we're going to talk about the factors that affect diffusion rate through pressure gradient, because remember that V gas is A, D, P1 minus P2 over thickness. So we're going to talk about this one, and we're going to also talk about the factors that affect oxygen unloading. So if you remember back when we talked about oxygen unloading in Chapter 7, we said unloading, the amount or the degree to which hemoglobin lets go. So remember I compared it to a magnet, and the magnet lets go. So when the oxygen and hemoglobin get to the working cells, hemoglobin needs to unload. And the factors that affect unloading are local factors. So what's going on around that particular muscle cell? Does it need unloading? And the local factors which would increase unloading would be a low PO2. Okay, if the muscle is working, it's using a lot of oxygen, the PO2 is low, and therefore we need to unload more in order to take up more. Another factor that affects unloading would be lower pH levels, another sign that that cell is working. As a cell is working, it's producing more lactic acid, and it is also producing more CO2. And we've talked about how the accumulation of CO2 can form lactic acid. Hopefully you remember that. Remember this? Okay, so we could be producing more lactic acid, or we could be producing more CO2. And either way, we're going to end up with more hydrogen ions, which means we end up with a lower pH. And the lower pH also stimulates unloading. The third factor was temperature. Okay, and remember that when we are making, when we're doing work, we're producing heat. Okay, we produce heat in aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism. So through aerobic metabolism, we talked about this. Okay. So when we're making more ATP, we're producing more heat. we also get friction between the muscle fibers. When the actin and myosin slide, we get friction. This is going to generate heat. Okay, and higher heat is going to stimulate greater oxygen unloading because, again, it's an indicator of work. So if the local factors indicate that the cell is doing work, that means the cell needs more ATP, the cell needs more oxygen, we get more unloading, so we can take up more, and that causes an increase in VO2 difference and a decrease in VO2max. So let's talk about the last two factors that are going to come off the top and how they come in here to here and here. Okay? Alright, so there's your local factors. There's the diffusion rate, which we talked about. Alright, so the last two factors we're going to talk about. Another factor coming off of the top of your map is going to be an increase in mitochondrial size and number. Okay, so one of the things that happens when you train is that your trained muscle cells develop more mitochondria and the mitochondria get bigger. Okay, and the mitochondria is using oxygen and it's producing more aerobic ATP. So if you have more mitochondria, you're going to be able to produce more aerobic ATP. Okay? Because the mitochondria is the location of aerobic ATP production. And remember that aerobic ATP production requires oxygen. So if we're making more aerobic ATP, we're going to be using more oxygen. Correct? Okay. So here's the top. The bottom, okay, so what we have down here is where we're trying to connect VO2max, VO2 difference, oxygen uptake rate. Okay, and we said oxygen uptake rate is affected by V gas and hemoglobin unloading. Okay, so where does mitochondrial size and number come into this? Okay. Here's your capillary, here's your muscle. Remember, we have oxygen going like this. Okay, so oxygen uptake rate is okay, and this pressure gradient is the gradient between the capillary and the muscle. Okay, oxygen is moving from the capillary into the muscle, therefore this is P1 and this is P2. This oxygen is coming from your arteries. And remember that the oxygen content of the arteries does not change during exercise. Okay, so P1 doesn't change during exercise. So the only way for this pressure gradient to get larger is for P2 to drop. Okay, and that's exactly what happens. If you've got more mitochondria and you've got bigger mitochondria, you're able to produce aerobic ATP faster, which means that you're using oxygen faster. If you're using oxygen faster, you end up with a lower PO2 in the muscle. And the PO2 in the muscle is P2. Okay? And if P2 is lower, then V gas is lower. Okay? Alright, so to summarize, more mitochondrial size and number means that we can make more aerobic ATP, which means that we're going to use more oxygen, which means that the oxygen level in the muscle is going to drop more during exercise. Okay. Let's see, I missed something here. So in between here, this is true, but in between here what we're seeing is a greater pressure gradient. Okay, what gradient are we talking about? We're talking about the gradient between the capillary and the muscle. Okay, and a pressure gradient is P1 minus P2. And this gradient is increasing because P2 is dropping. Okay, this is P2. So a drop in P2 causes a rise in the pressure gradient. When we have a higher pressure gradient, we have a higher V gas. Okay, so this comes in here. And with a greater V gas, we take up more oxygen, greater VO2 difference, greater VO2max. Okay? So that is one of the results of a greater mitochondrial size and number. Now there's another side effect that comes out here when we have a reduction in muscle PO2. Okay, so let's talk about that. So let's start from there. Decrease in muscle PO2, okay, and we talked about how that's going to increase V gas because it increases the pressure gradient. It also has another effect. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so unloading is determined by local factors. One of the local factors is the PO2 in the muscle. Okay, so this drop in PO2 in the muscle, okay, increases V gas and increases uptake rate that way, but it also has a second effect, and that it increases hemoglobin unloading. And with greater hemoglobin unloading, we have a greater oxygen uptake rate. Greater VO2 difference, greater VO2 max. Okay, so this muscle PO2 let's see. This comes here. So the lower muscle PO2 affects uptake rate two different ways. Okay. So if we go back up here, this uptake rate, find another color, this uptake rate due to lower PO2, this lower PO2 also comes in over here. Okay? So two different ways a lower muscle PO2 contributes to a greater uptake rate. Alright, so we have one more to talk about, So that was mitochondrial size and number. The last one that's going to come off the top here is an increased oxidative enzyme activity rate. Okay, another one of the 11 that comes off the top. So with training, the oxidative enzymes become more active, which means the oxidative processes can happen faster. Okay, which means that we can get greater aerobic ATP production rate. Okay, we just saw this. Okay, so here we see an overlap. We already saw this with the increased size and number of mitochondria. Okay, so here we have complete overlap from what we've already talked about. So two things contributing to an increased aerobic ATP production rate. We've got enzymes becoming more active, and we have more and larger mitochondria. So let's see, this would come in here. Increase oxidative enzyme rate would come in here. Okay? And so their effect at this point is going to overlap. More mitochondria, bigger mitochondria, faster aerobic enzymes, more aerobic ATP, more oxygen usage. The PO2 in the muscle is going to drop more. The PO2 in the muscle drops more. The gradient between the capillary and the muscle is going to be greater, which means V gas is going to be greater, greater uptake rate, greater AVO2 difference, greater VO2max. Okay. And that PO2, remember this PO2 also has another leg, so it goes here, and it has another leg, which we talked about here. Okay, so it increases V gas, it also increases unloading, and unloading is going to increase uptake rate. Okay. Now going back to this slide, so we've talked about this is not a factor, this is not a factor. We've talked about this, we've talked about this, we've talked about this. Yes, these are potentially factors, but as I said, we need to draw the line on this concept map, so I've chosen not to include these two on the concept map, not because they don't change with training, but because there just has to be a limit to this map. So if you think about it, if you are achieving greater amounts of work, you may get a bigger drop in pH, although I'm not sure that that happens. You also may have a bigger rise in temperature. Again, I'm not sure that that happens. And if it does, it's probably to a smaller extent. So the primary reason for greater oxygen unloading with training is due to a lower PO2 in the muscle because we're using more oxygen. If pH drops more and temperature rises more, it's relatively minor, and that's why I chose not to include it on this concept map. Okay, so now with the 7 recordings, if you go back and piece them together, you should have cardiorespiratory endurance training. Coming off the top, you have 11 different factors contributing to increased VO2max. VO2max is due to cardiac output and AVO2 difference. Okay, so everything coming off the top is going to connect either to this one, and in some cases both.